There is a moment, quiet and unremarkable, that happens in kitchens all over the world every single day. Someone turns on a flame, or they press a button and a coil glows orange beneath a pan, or they reach into a microwave and hear that particular hum begin. And somewhere in that gesture, that entirely automatic, barely noticed action of applying heat to food is one of the oldest and most profound decisions a living creature ever made. Because here is the thing about that gesture. No other animal in the natural world does it. Not one. A chimpanzee, our closest living relative, shares somewhere around 98 to 99% of our DNA. It uses tools. It forms complex social bonds. It shows signs of empathy. It mourns its dead. And yet, it eats everything raw. It has never, not once in its entire evolutionary history, just chosen to hold a piece of meat over a flame before eating it. Neither has any other primate. Neither has any other mammal. No bird, no reptile, no fish. On an entire planet teeming with life, across millions of species that have walked or swum or crawled through billions of years of existence, the act of deliberately applying fire to food and then eating the result has happened exactly once. It happened with us. That is a strange and extraordinary thing to hold in your mind for a moment. We are so accustomed to cooking that it has become invisible. Every culture on Earth cooks. Every known human society, from the smallest forager band deep in the Amazon rainforest to the most industrialized city in the world, prepares food using heat. Anthropologists have never found a single group of humans, anywhere, who lived entirely on raw food. In not one exception, not one outlier. Cooking is not a development of civilization. It is not a product of agriculture, or settled life, or written language. It reaches all the way back through the dark tunnel of human prehistory, into times so remote that the people living then would barely be recognizable to us today. And yet, they were cooking. The question of when and how our ancestors first began cooking is one of the great unsolved mysteries of human origins. It sits at the intersection of archaeology, evolutionary biology, paleoanthropology, and chemistry. It involves fierce debates between some of the sharpest minds in the scientific world. And the answers, as they slowly emerge from the ash-stained sediments of ancient cave sites and the analysis of fossilized fish teeth, are stranger and more wonderful than anyone expected. But this story is not just about fire and food. It is about what cooking made possible. Because the consensus, growing stronger with every new study, is that cooking did not simply make our food tastier or safer to eat. Cooking, the regular, habitual, sustained application of heat to food, may have fundamentally remade the human body. It may have shrunk our guts and grown our brains. It may have given us the spare time and energy to develop language, art, and culture. It may have created the hearth, that central gathering point around which communities formed, and stories were told, and the long, quiet evenings of human social life first came to exist. To understand where cooking came from is to understand, in a very real sense, where we came from. So, let us go back, far back, further than most people realize, if it is even possible. Is back past every written record, past every carved stone, past every painted cave wall, past every shaped tool. Back to a time when the creatures who would eventually become us were still working out what they were. Back to the raw world that existed before the very first flame was ever held to the very first piece of meat. This is the story of how humans learned to cook. And it begins, as so many human stories do, with hunger. Consider what the world looked like 2 million years ago. The African continent is warming and drying, its great forests shrinking at the edges, giving way to spreading grasslands studded with acacia trees and cut through with rivers and lakes. Across these savannas and along the shores of ancient waterways, the ancestors of the human lineage are doing something that no primate had done before them in quite the same way. They are beginning to walk, not shuffle, not knuckle walk. They are standing fully upright on 2 legs, moving across open ground in a way that leaves their hands free and their eyes elevated above the tall grass. These are not yet humans in any modern sense. The beings that archaeologists call Australopithecus, and the earliest members of the genus Homo, creatures like Homo habilis, have brains considerably smaller than ours. Their faces jut forward, their teeth are large, their jaws deep and powerful. They are spending a very significant portion of every day doing what all their primate relatives do. They are chewing. Hard, slowly, repeatedly. Think about what a chimpanzee's day looks like. And studies of wild chimpanzees show that they can spend anywhere from 4 to 7 hours a day just eating. The fibrous, hard, often bitter fruits and leaves that make up the bulk of their diet require enormous mechanical effort to break down. Their jaws are immensely powerful. Their teeth are large and built for grinding. And even with all that physical effort, much of what they eat passes through their digestive systems relatively intact, which is why primates in general have very long, elaborate guts. They need all that length and volume to ferment and break down the tough raw plant material they consume. Our early ancestors were not wildly different from this. They were eating a diet largely composed of tough plant foods, tubers, seeds, fibrous vegetation, supplemented by whatever animal matter they could access. Or early evidence of cut marks on animal bones, found at sites in Ethiopia, dating back roughly 3.3 million years, suggests that even very early hominins were using sharp stone flakes to scrape meat from carcasses. But this meat was raw. Everything was raw. And raw food of the kind available on the African savanna is not terribly easy to digest. This matters enormously for the story of cooking because it sets up the central problem that cooking would eventually solve. The human brain is extraordinarily expensive, calorically speaking. Today, the human brain accounts for roughly 2% of our body weight, but it consumes around 20% of our daily energy. That is a staggering proportion. It is vastly more than the brains of other mammals consume relative to body size. And a brain this hungry can only be sustained if the food that feeds it is calorie-dense and digestible enough to actually release those calories in usable form. Here is the thing about raw food. It does not always do that. A raw potato, for example, contains a perfectly respectable number of total calories, but the starches inside a raw potato are largely resistant to human digestion. You could eat raw potatoes all day and still not get enough usable energy out of them to sustain normal brain function. The same is true for many root tubers, seeds, and tough meats. The calories are there, technically, but they are locked up inside cell walls and complex molecular structures that the human digestive system is not well equipped to break open. Before cooking existed, our ancestors faced a hard ceiling on how much usable energy they could extract from their food, no matter how much of it they ate. And that ceiling placed a firm limit on how large and how energy-hungry a brain could realistically become. Something had to change, and it did. Though nobody knows exactly when or exactly how, something happened that cracked that ceiling open and changed the course of life on this planet forever. Section 2. Before Fire. The raw world of our ancestors. To truly appreciate what cooking meant, it helps to spend a little more time in the world that existed before it. Not the earliest hominin world, but the world of the creatures immediately preceding the Great Leap. Because this is where the pressure was building, where the conditions for cooking were slowly assembling themselves over geological time. Say, imagine it is around 2.5 million years ago. Somewhere in what is now East Africa, a small group of hominins is moving through a landscape of dry woodland and open grassland. They are walking upright. Their brains are somewhat larger than a chimpanzee's, but still modest by the standards of what will come later. They are carrying sharp stone flakes, some of the earliest deliberately made cutting tools ever found. The archaeology of sites like Gona in Ethiopia, where stone tools have been dated to approximately 2.7 million years ago, tells us that these early hominins were using technology to process food. They were cutting meat off bones and cracking those bones open to extract the rich, calorie-dense marrow inside. This is significant. A bone marrow is one of the most energy-dense foods available in nature, packed with fat and calories that are far more accessible than the tough fibrous plant matter that dominated primate diets. And eating meat, even raw meat, opened up new nutritional territory. It supplied amino acids, fats, and concentrated calories that plant foods often could not provide in sufficient quantities. There is compelling evidence that the earliest expansions in hominin brain size were connected, at least in part, to this dietary shift toward including more animal-sourced foods. But raw meat presents serious problems. Raw meat is extremely tough to chew, especially the kind of muscle tissue that comes from large savanna animals that spend their lives running and fleeing. A 2016 study published in the journal Nature, led by Harvard researchers Catherine Zink and Daniel Lieberman, demonstrated this vividly. They recruited volunteers to chew raw goat meat and tubers under different preparation conditions, raw, sliced, pounded, and measured the time and force required. What they found was remarkable. Even unprocessed raw meat required an enormous amount of chewing effort. The food often balled up into clumps that were difficult to swallow and digest effectively, delivering relatively few of its potential calories to the body. Slicing the meat with a sharp stone helped considerably. And pounding, smashing tough foods with a hammer stone to break down their structure, helped even more. There is evidence from very early stone tool sites that some hominins were doing exactly this, using rounded hammer stones to pound food before eating it. Yet this kind of mechanical food processing was a significant innovation in its own right, a kind of proto-cooking that did not involve heat at all, but still made food easier to digest and extracted more usable energy from it. The Australopithecines are particularly revealing about what the pre-cooking hominin body looked like. Paranthropus boisei, one of the so-called robust Australopithecines that lived in East Africa from roughly 2.3 to 1.2 million years ago, had what paleoanthropologists sometimes describe as a face built for heavy-duty chewing. It had a massive flat face with enormous cheekbones, a pronounced sagittal crest running along the top of the skull for jaw muscle attachment, and molars so large and flat surfaced that they resembled millstones. And this was a creature whose entire skull architecture was organized around the demand of processing hard, tough, abrasive food. It was the raw diet pushed to its physical extreme. Then, roughly 1.8 million years ago, a new kind of hominin appeared. Scientists call this creature Homo erectus, and it looked fundamentally different from everything that had come before. Homo erectus was taller and longer-legged. Its skull was larger, housing a brain considerably bigger than any earlier hominin. Its teeth were dramatically smaller. Its jaw was reduced, its chewing muscles less powerful. The bony crests needed to anchor massive jaw muscles were gone. The skull had a new organization, one that allocated space not for jaw muscle attachment, but for brain expansion. Something had fundamentally changed in what these creatures were eating, and how they were processing it. And the most compelling explanation for how all this became possible, for how Homo erectus broke through the raw food ceiling that had constrained its ancestors, brings us to fire. Section 3. The First Flames. How our ancestors encountered fire. Fire was not invented by humans. Fire existed on Earth long before any human walked across the African plains. Lightning strikes have been igniting wildfires for hundreds of millions of years. Volcanoes pour rivers of molten rock across the landscape. Fire was a fact of the natural world long before any primate decided to do something intentional with it. And for most animals, fire is simply a thing to flee from. The heat, the smoke, the noise, the destruction, every instinct in a typical animal's brain screams to run, hard, fast, far. But hominins are not typical animals. They are among the most curious, most cognitively flexible, most behaviorally inventive creatures that have ever existed. And at some point, likely many separate times, in many separate places, over a very long period, individual hominins began to respond to fire a little differently. Perhaps the first thing they noticed was what fire left behind. When a wildfire sweeps through a landscape and dies down, the aftermath is rich with opportunity. Animals caught in the blaze are cooked, their flesh tender and more accessible than raw meat from a fresh kill. Seeds and tubers at the edges of the burned zone may have been lightly heated, changing their texture and flavor in appealing ways. The burned ground itself becomes temporarily free of dense undergrowth, easier to move across and search. There is fascinating modern evidence for this kind of opportunistic fire use. Certain birds in Australia, black kites, whistling kites, and brown falcons, are now well documented to deliberately pick up burning sticks from wildfires and carry them to unburned areas, apparently to flush out the small animals that flee the smoke and heat. This behavior has been observed repeatedly by indigenous Australians over many generations and documented on video by ornithologists. If birds can learn to use fire as a tool, it is not difficult to imagine that cognitively sophisticated hominins could have begun interacting with natural fire in opportunistic ways long before they developed anything like deliberate fire control. The first step was probably not making fire at all. The first step was keeping it. Taking a burning brand from the edge of a wildfire and carrying it back to a shelter, feeding it dry grass and twigs to keep it alive. nursing a flame through the night, because the darkness of the African savanna was dangerous, because predators moved through that darkness, and fire kept them away. The warmth alone would have been compelling in a world without any form of clothing or constructed shelter. The light extended the usable hours of the day into the long African evenings. Consider what that transition would have looked like in practice. A group of early hominins, perhaps Homo erectus or an immediate ancestor, moving through a landscape that a wildfire had passed through some days before. The ground is still warm in places. Partially burned animals lie scattered. Among the debris, a piece of wood is still smoldering. On one individual, curious, attentive, with some prior experience of natural fires, picks it up, carries it, finds that it can be kept alive with careful feeding, brings it back to the night camp. From that moment forward, everything begins to change. The group now has fire, not fire they made, but fire they maintain. They learn, through experience and observation and accumulated practical knowledge, how to feed it and tend it, how to keep it alive in rain, how to revive it from embers the next morning, how to position themselves around it for warmth. And, sooner or later, perhaps by accident, perhaps by deliberate experiment, they discover what happens when food is placed near those flames or in those embers. The food changes, the outside chars, the inside softens. Yet the smell shifts from raw and faintly unpleasant to something deeply appealing, something that triggers instinctive salivation. The food is easier to chew. And, though they had no framework for understanding why, it was delivering more usable energy to their bodies. The archaeological evidence for the earliest controlled fire use is frustratingly sparse, partly because fire leaves subtle traces that do not always survive geological time. But what we have is compelling. In the Koubi-Fora region of Kenya, reddened sediments have been identified that may indicate heating consistent with controlled fire around 1.5 million years ago. Burned bones from Swartkrans Cave in South Africa, associated with early Homo, date to around 1.5 million years ago, with burning patterns suggesting fire temperatures rather than natural grass fires. Yet these are not universally accepted as definitive, but they form part of a picture. Then there is Wonderwork Cave, and Wonderwork Cave changes things considerably. Situated in the Kuruman Hills of South Africa's northern Cape Province, Wonderwork, a word meaning miracle in Afrikaans, is a massive cavern that extends roughly 140 meters horizontally into the base of a rocky hill. It has been occupied intermittently for approximately 2 million years. And deep inside this cave, in layers of sediment dated to approximately 1 million years ago, researchers from the University of Toronto and Hebrew University made a discovery that pushed the known timeline of controlled fire use back by 300,000 years. By using Fourier transform infrared microspectroscopy, a technique that identifies the molecular signatures of burned organic material, they found microscopic traces of wood ash and charred bone fragments embedded in the cave's sediment. Plant material had been burned there, animal bones had been burned there, and crucially, this burned material was found more than 30 meters inside the cave, deep in its interior, far beyond the reach of any natural wildfire or lightning strike. It was in there because someone carried fire in there, and that someone was almost certainly Homo erectus. The discovery, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012, was significant not just for its date, but for what it implied about the relationship between these hominins and fire. That fire maintained deep inside a cave is fire integrated into daily life. Fire as a managed resource, not a scavenged accident. Whether those fires were used primarily for warmth, light, protection from predators, or cooking, or all of these things simultaneously, is harder to determine. But Richard Wrangham has made the point repeatedly. Once you are regularly controlling fire, the step from keeping a fire burning to placing food in or near it is not a large cognitive one. It is, in fact, almost inevitable. Section 4. The Fishermen of Gesher Benot Yaakov. The site has a beautiful, almost musical name, Gesher Benot Yaakov. In Hebrew it means Bridge of the Daughters of Jacob, a reference to a nearby ford on the Jordan River, where a bridge has stood since ancient times. The site itself sits on the banks of what was once the ancient Hula Lake in what is now northern Israel, not far from the Syrian border. For more than 15 years, teams of archaeologists from 8 institutions across Israel, England and Germany worked methodically through the layers of preserved sediment here. They found stone tools of the Acheulean tradition, the large hand axes and bifacial implements associated with Homo erectus populations as they moved out of Africa into Eurasia. They found seeds and nuts, evidence of plant food exploitation. They found the bones of large mammals, and they found, in enormous quantities, the teeth of fish, specifically carp, a species of large freshwater carp that once thrived in the Hula Lake, a fish that could grow up to 2 meters, roughly 6.5 feet in length. Yet these carp teeth were not randomly distributed through the site's sediments. They appeared in concentrated deposits, in specific archaeological horizons, reflecting repeated and deliberate gathering and processing of fish over many generations of occupation at this site. What the researchers needed to determine was whether these fish had simply been eaten raw or whether they had been subjected to deliberate heat. And here is where the elegance of the science comes in, because fish teeth carry within their enamel a chemical signature of the temperatures they have experienced, and that signature can be read by the right instruments. Teeth enamel is composed of hydroxyapatite crystals. When these crystals are exposed to heat, they grow larger in a measurable and predictable way. The pattern of crystal growth is specific and distinctive. It differs from what happens when teeth are exposed to the low and inconsistent temperatures of a natural grass fire. It differs from what happens when teeth decompose in warm sediment over millennia. By analyzing the crystal structure of the pharyngeal teeth, the throat teeth carp used to grind hard materials, the researchers could determine not just whether the fish had been heated, but at what temperature range and under what conditions. What they found was published in the journal Nature Ecology and Evolution in November 2022, and it sent genuine ripples through the paleoanthropology community. The fish had been cooked. The crystal structure showed exposure to temperatures between roughly 200 and 500 degrees Celsius, well within the range of controlled cooking, and not consistent with the high and unpredictable temperatures of open wildfire. The pattern was not random burning. It was consistent with deliberate, sustained application of controlled heat. The teeth at this site were dated to approximately 780,000 years ago, pushing back the direct evidence for cooking food by more than 600,000 years compared to the previous record, which had stood at around 170,000 years. The most likely inhabitants of the Gesher Benot Yaakov site at that time were late populations of Homo erectus, or early Homo heidelbergensis, archaic hominins with brains smaller than ours, living in a world utterly unlike the present. And they were cooking carp on the shores of a lake in what would eventually become the Middle East. While we do not know exactly how the fish were cooked, noted archaeologist Jens Najorka of the Natural History Museum in London, one of the collaborators on the study. But given the lack of evidence of exposure to high temperatures, it is clear that they were not cooked directly in fire, and were not thrown into a fire as waste. The most likely method was gentle indirect heating, the fish placed near hot coals or on hot stones, heated slowly and carefully to cooking temperature without charring. Think about what that implies. Someone at this lake, 780,000 years ago, caught a very large fish. Then, rather than simply eating it raw on the spot, they took it somewhere near their fire, positioned it, waited, and cooked it. They understood at some level that heating the fish would change it in a way that was desirable. Yet they had the patience to wait. They had the knowledge to control the heat. This is planning. This is an understanding of cause and effect extended over time. This is technology applied to the transformation of food. The sheer quantity of fish teeth found at the site tells another story. This was not a one-time accidental discovery. The site shows evidence of repeated occupation over a long period. The researchers describe it as a place where hominins returned again and again, building fires, catching fish, cooking, and eating them. Fish eating and the cooking of fish was part of the routine structure of their lives here. This was, in a meaningful sense, the beginning of a culinary tradition, a set of practices around food preparation that were learned, repeated, and passed on. The site at Gesher Benot Yaakov also sits along what paleoanthropologists believe was a key corridor for hominin migration out of Africa, a route northward, following freshwater habitats that Homo erectus populations used as they spread into Eurasia. The rich food resources of freshwater environments, fish, shellfish, aquatic plants, the mammals that came to drink, would have provided consistent nutrition along this route. And the ability to cook those resources, to extract more nutrition from each meal, may have made the critical difference between groups that could push further into new and challenging environments and those that could not. Cooking fish was not a luxury. At a fundamental level, it may have been what made human global spread possible. This is Section 5, The Cooking Hypothesis, Richard Wrangham and the Great Debate. In 1999, a British primatologist at Harvard University published a short, provocative paper in the journal Current Anthropology. Richard Wrangham had been studying wild chimpanzees in Uganda for more than 20 years by that point, since 1970, when he first traveled to Gombe as a student of Jane Goodall's. He had eaten chimpanzee food in the field, systematically, deliberately, trying to understand the chimp diet from the inside. He described the experience as deeply unpleasant, fibrous, bitter, full of strange tastes and textures that the human palate revolted against. And from this experience, he had reached a conclusion that seemed obvious to him, but that the scientific establishment found deeply unsettling. Humans were not just animals that happened to cook their food for cultural reasons. Humans were animals whose bodies had been fundamentally rebuilt by cooking. Cooking had not adapted to the human body. The human body had adapted to cooking, and if that was true, then cooking must be very ancient indeed. Ancient enough to have driven the major evolutionary changes that separate humans from all other primates. In 2009, Wrangham expanded his argument into a book that became a touchstone in paleoanthropology, Catching Fire: How Cooking Made Us Human. The title made the argument explicit. Not that cooking was something humans developed, but that cooking was something that made humans. The core of the argument rests on the dramatic anatomical changes that appear in the fossil record around 1.8 million years ago. With the emergence of Homo erectus. The differences between Homo erectus and its predecessors are not subtle, they are stark. Homo erectus was significantly larger-bodied, standing roughly our height. Its brain was around 50% larger than that of Homo habilis, the species that preceded it. Its gut appears to have been smaller and less elaborate, evidenced by a flatter ribcage profile compared to the barrel-chested, pot-bellied form of earlier hominins and living great apes. Its teeth were dramatically reduced in size, and its jaw muscles were less powerful. The sagittal crest that anchored those massive chewing muscles in earlier species was gone. This collection of changes points in one direction. Here is a creature that ate food softer and more digestible than what its predecessors ate. And here is a creature that was getting enough calories from its diet to support a significantly larger brain without needing a significantly larger gut. Wrangham's argument was that only cooking could explain this package of changes. Meat eating alone was insufficient. Raw meat is hard to chew, and the caloric advantages of raw meat over raw plant food are limited, especially since raw lean savanna meat is largely protein, and high-protein diets create metabolic stress when consumed without adequate fat. Cooking does something qualitatively different. Cooking denatures proteins, making them far more accessible to digestive enzymes. Cooking gelatinizes starches, transforming tough raw carbohydrates into easily absorbed sugars. Cooking breaks down plant cell walls, releasing locked nutrients. So the net result is that cooked food delivers significantly more usable calories per gram than the same food eaten raw. His argument draws further support from studies of modern raw foodists, people who have deliberately switched to diets of entirely raw and unprocessed food. These studies consistently find that people on raw food diets lose weight, often dramatically. In populations of women who are strict raw foodists, significant rates of amenorrhea, the loss of menstrual cycles, have been documented, suggesting that their bodies do not have enough energy to sustain reproductive function. The human body, Wrangham argues, has been adapted to a cooked diet for so long that it cannot adequately sustain itself on raw food alone. We are not simply animals who cook for pleasure, we are animals who physiologically require cooked food. Yes, the debate Wrangham's hypothesis ignited was fierce and remains ongoing. Critics raised several challenges. The most persistent was the archaeological evidence problem. The confirmed evidence for controlled fire use and cooking only extends back reliably to around 780,000 years ago at Gesher Benot Yaakov, and ambiguously to 1 million years ago at Wonderwork Cave. If cooking drove the emergence of Homo erectus 1.8 million years ago, then we should find fire evidence going back that far, and the archaeological record has not yet produced it in unambiguous form. Wrangham's response is thoughtful. Fire evidence, he points out, is notoriously difficult to preserve and identify in the archaeological record. Early campfires built by small mobile groups leave minimal traces: a patch of burned soil, some charred plant fragments, traces that can be destroyed by flooding, erosion, or later disturbance. In the absence of constructed stone hearths, which did not appear until considerably later in the record, detecting fire use is extremely challenging. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. He also points to the biology itself. The tooth size reduction, jaw muscle reduction, and gut size reduction seen in Homo erectus represent changes that would have taken many thousands of generations to accumulate under natural selection. If cooking began at 780,000 years ago, there would not have been enough time for these changes to have developed by the time Homo erectus appeared. The biological changes argue for an earlier origin of cooking than current archaeology can directly confirm. Daniel Lieberman and Catherine Zink offered an alternative explanation in their 2016 study. They proposed that mechanical food processing, slicing meat and pounding tubers with stone tools, as early hominins were demonstrably doing from at least 2.5 million years ago, could account for reductions in chewing effort without requiring cooking. Their experimental data showed that a mixed diet processed by stone tools significantly reduced chewing demand. This is a genuine contribution. Mechanical processing was almost certainly making a real difference to early hominin diets long before cooking began, but most researchers do not see this as an either-or. Mechanical processing may have begun the trend towards smaller teeth and jaws, and cooking, when it arrived, accelerated and deepened those changes. The explanations are not mutually exclusive. They may describe sequential innovations in a single long story of increasing food sophistication. What is not seriously in dispute is that cooking has had profound and transformative effects on human evolution. The only real disagreement is about timing. Section 6. How heat changed the human body. To understand what cooking did to the human body, it helps to think about what happens to food when you heat it. At a chemical level, the answer is remarkable. Take a starchy tuber, a sweet potato, or the kind of wild roots that early hominins would have dug from savanna soil. Raw, this tuber contains what is called resistant starch, named because it resists digestion by the enzymes in the human small intestine. These starches pass largely through the small intestine unabsorbed, eventually reaching the large intestine where gut bacteria can ferment them. But this process is slow, inefficient, and extracts only a fraction of the starch's potential caloric value. Apply heat, and everything changes. The starch granules absorb water and swell. They gelatinize. Their tightly packed crystalline structures break down into looser forms that digestive enzymes can attack quickly and efficiently. The same tuber that delivered limited usable energy when raw now delivers dramatically more when cooked. The calories are no longer locked away. Proteins in meat undergo a similar transformation. The complex folded structures of protein molecules, the same structures that make raw meat tough and chewy, are denatured by heat. As they unfold and become more accessible to the protein-digesting enzymes in the stomach and small intestine. Cooking also kills pathogens, the bacteria and parasites that raw meat often harbors. In a world without medicine, this protection alone would have been a meaningful survival advantage. The net effect was to reduce the energetic cost of digestion itself. Digestion is not free. Breaking down food in the gut requires significant energy. When food arrives pre-processed by heat, the digestive system has to do less work to extract nutrients. Less work means less energy spent on digestion, which means more energy available for everything else, including the brain. The human gut is, compared to those of other great apes, surprisingly small. Our intestines are roughly 60% shorter than would be predicted for a primate of our body size. A shorter, less elaborate gut is a gut that has been liberated from the need to ferment enormous quantities of tough, raw vegetation, and the energy saved from reducing gut size was redirected upward, into the brain. The expensive tissue hypothesis, developed by Leslie Aiello and Peter Wheeler in 1995, captures this dynamic precisely. The gut and the brain are both metabolically expensive organs. The gut is unusual among mammals in that it can vary in size according to dietary quality. Animals on higher quality, more digestible diets can sustain themselves with less gut. As the hominin gut shrank, the energy budget it had consumed became available for reallocation, and evolution directed that energy toward expanded cognitive capacity. Because human teeth are dramatically smaller than those of any other primate of comparable body size. Our molars are tiny compared to the grinding surfaces of chimpanzee or gorilla teeth. Our canines are negligible. Human jaw muscles are modest enough that our skulls are smooth on top. We have a round domed cranium precisely because we no longer need the architectural reinforcement required by powerful chewing apparatus. The space freed up by the reduction of jaw muscles allowed the brain case to expand more freely, contributing to the distinctive round-skulled profile that marks modern Homo sapiens. There is also the human myosin heavy chain gene, a gene involved in jaw muscle size, in which humans carry a specific mutation that limits the maximum power of our jaw muscles compared to all other primates. As chimpanzees and gorillas have jaw muscles so powerful that they significantly constrain skull shape, forcing the cranium into configurations that limit brain volume. Our reduced jaw muscles remove that constraint. This mutation arose sometime in the past 2 to 3 million years, and it may have been one of the genetic preconditions for the brain expansion that defines our lineage, a mutation that made sense only in the context of a lineage that had already been eating progressively softer food for a long time. Human sleep patterns are also unusual among primates in ways that connect to fire and cooking. Most primates sleep in trees, safe from ground-level predators. Sleeping on the ground is dangerous, but a well-maintained fire changes this calculation. A fire at the entrance to a shelter keeps predators at a distance. Lions and leopards have a deep-seated aversion to fire that has been observed and documented repeatedly by researchers. Wrangham argues that the shift to ground sleeping was made possible by fire, and this shift may have enabled longer, deeper periods of consolidated sleep that allowed the enlarged human brain to consolidate memory and process complex information in ways that the more fragmented, vigilant sleep of tree-sleeping primates cannot support. The shift to cooked food did not change one thing about the human body. It changed almost everything. Section 7. The Social Fire, Community, Language, and the Hearth. There is a story that happens every single time a group of people gathers around a campfire or a fireplace. Yes, if you have ever sat with friends or family around an open flame in the evening, you know this story without being told. The conversation changes. The pace slows. People speak more personally, more openly, more reflectively. Stories that would not emerge in daylight seem to come forward more easily in the particular quality of firelight. This is not a coincidence. This appears to be a deeply ancient behavioral pattern written into us by hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, and it has been studied directly in one of the most remarkable pieces of field research ever conducted in anthropology. In 2014, anthropologist Polly Weisner published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. Weisner had been visiting the Juahuansi people of Botswana since 1974, when they still lived as traditional hunter-gatherers. In over 4 decades, she recorded the contents of their conversations during the day and around the campfire at night. The contrast was dramatic and statistically robust. During the day, roughly 75% of conversations were focused on practical and social management matters, work, complaints, economic issues, gossip about people nearby. The conversations were direct, concerned with immediate practicalities. Around the fire at night, everything shifted. Over 80% of the conversations were devoted to stories about distant relatives and their adventures, about unusual encounters with animals or other groups, about spirits and the supernatural, about the relationships and dramas of people not present. The night conversations crossed generations. Elders and young people participated together, with the elders carrying much of the weight of communal narrative and memory. What Weisner concluded was that firelight had created a social space that did not exist in the same form during the daylight hours. The darkness rendered body language less visible, making voice and words more important. The warmth and containment of the fire brought people physically close together. The extension of the active day, adding perhaps 4 additional hours of social time beyond sunset, gave communities an enormous amount of time for exactly the kind of relationship building, story sharing, and collective meaning making that human culture depends upon. Evolutionary anthropologist Robin Dunbar, who developed the social brain hypothesis, the idea that the human brain expanded primarily to manage the complexity of large social groups, has written extensively about the implications of Wiesner's research. He pointed out that the campfire offers an environmental context uniquely suited to the development of language. You can hear speech across a fire, even from people whose faces you cannot clearly see. You can participate in conversations with multiple people simultaneously. Language, in this fire-lit context, is the primary mechanism for social bonding, far more efficient than the one-on-one physical grooming that other primates use, because speech can maintain social relationships with many individuals across the space of a single evening gathering. The campfire, in Wiesner's and Dunbar's analyses, was the original classroom, or the original theater, the original forum. It was where lessons were transmitted across generations, where social norms were negotiated and reinforced, where the collective memory of the group, knowledge of seasonal resources, migration routes, the history of past conflicts and alliances, was kept alive and available through oral narrative. In a world without writing, without any external storage medium for information, knowledge lived only in the minds of living people. When an elder died without transmitting what they knew, that knowledge died with them. The regular evening gathering around the fire was the primary setting in which the accumulated knowledge of the community, where water could be found in dry years, how animals migrated, which plants were edible and which were poisonous, was kept alive through narrative and direct instruction. The great advantage of this system was its social nature. Information shared around a fire is heard by everyone present, including the young. Knowledge distributed across many minds is resilient to individual mortality in a way that knowledge held by a single person is not. The campfire was not just entertainment, it was the living library of the community. Wrangham adds another dimension, the household. He argues that cooking created the conditions for the paired domestic partnership, the human family unit, that is universal across cultures. In a world of shared cooking, food becomes a medium of exchange. A person cooking a meal invests significant time and labor in producing food that others might consume. A partner who provides protection and resources in exchange for shared meals provides something genuinely valuable to both parties. This arrangement, Wrangham suggests, may be the deep evolutionary origin of the human household, the hearth as the center of a domestic unit, the shared meal as the daily ritual that bound it together. This is speculative, and Wrangham acknowledges it goes beyond what can be directly demonstrated from the archaeological record. But it is not unreasonable. In the Nyungar language of the Noongar people of present-day Australia, the word for fire and the word for family share the same root. The English word hearth is embedded in the word heart and has long served as a metonym for home. The shared meal is not just nourishment, it is ceremony. It is the daily renewal of the social bonds that hold families and communities together. Fire made us more efficient eaters, but it also made us more deeply social, more culturally coherent, and more cognitively capable than any other species that has ever existed. Section 8. Refinements in the Dark. Neanderthals and Complex Cooking. For a long time, the story of cooking was told almost entirely as a Homo sapiens story. Neanderthals, in the old telling, were brutes, heavy-browed, thick-boned, primarily carnivorous, living short, brutal lives in the cold of Ice Age Europe and Western Asia. They left no evidence of culture, the story went. They cooked crudely, if at all, shoving raw meat into fire and tearing it apart. This story is wrong, dramatically, provably, and in a way that changes how we understand both Neanderthals and the deep history of cooking. It is wrong. The evidence has been building for decades. Starch grains preserved in the dental calculus of Neanderthal teeth, chemical traces of cooked plants found in the fossilized dental plaque from multiple Neanderthal sites across Europe and the Middle East, and, most spectacularly, analyses of charred food remains at two remarkable archaeological sites that have become central to our understanding of Paleolithic culinary culture. Shanidar Cave sits in the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq, at an elevation offering a commanding view of a valley rich with game animals and plant resources. It is already famous in paleoanthropology. It is the site where, in the 1950s and 1960s, archaeologist Ralph Selecki discovered the remains of multiple Neanderthal individuals, including one associated with concentrated pollen from flowering plants arranged in what appeared to be deliberate pattern, suggesting the possibility of ritual burial. Whether that interpretation is correct remains debated. but the cave's Neanderthal occupation layers have more recently yielded evidence of something equally remarkable: complex, multi-step food preparation. The study, published in the journal Antiquity in November 2022 by Dr. Karen Kabukshu of the University of Liverpool and colleagues, analyzed charred plant material from both Shanidar Cave and Franchthai Cave in Greece. At Shanidar, the Neanderthal material dated to approximately 70,000 years ago. The picture was not simple food charred and eaten. So the Neanderthals had been preparing plant foods using several distinct processing steps before cooking. Wild pulses, beans, lentils, and vetch are naturally bitter and mildly toxic when consumed raw in quantity. To be safe and palatable, they need to be soaked in water for extended periods to leach out bitter compounds, then pounded or ground to break down their cell structure, and then cooked. This multi-step process requires both knowledge and patience, and this is exactly what the evidence at Shanidar suggests was happening 70,000 years ago. The charred remains showed plant material that had been coarsely pounded and processed before cooking. Wild nuts and grass seeds were combined with pulses to create mixed preparations. Wild mustard appeared in the assemblage, with its sharp and distinctive flavor. Think about what this means. The Neanderthals were not identifying edible plants and throwing them into a fire. They were working with plants that were not directly edible in raw form, transforming them through knowledge-intensive processing into food that was both safe and good. They were combining ingredients with different flavor profiles. They were, in every meaningful sense of the word, cooking, not just heating food, but transforming it through technique and knowledge. Our findings are the first real indication of complex cooking, and thus of food culture, among Neanderthals, said Chris Hunt of Liverpool John Moores University, co-author of the study. The soaking and pounding of pulses documented at Shanidar represents the oldest direct evidence of food processing outside Africa, older than any comparable evidence from early modern human sites anywhere in the world beyond the African continent. Even more remarkable, the researchers who tried to recreate a Neanderthal recipe from Shanidar, combining the identified plant species in roughly the proportions suggested by the remains, produced what Hunt described as a sort of pancake-cum-flatbread, which was really very palatable, a sort of nutty taste. These were not desperate creatures eating whatever they could find. These were people with developed food knowledge, making food that was genuinely good. There is additional evidence from sites across Neanderthal Europe. At El Cedrón Cave in Spain, a chemical analysis of dental calculus found traces of plants including yarrow and chamomile, herbs with distinctive flavors but minimal nutritional value, suggesting use as flavorings or condiments. At Khabara Cave in Israel, evidence suggests Neanderthals were regularly cooking their foods rather than eating them raw. Studies of starch grains from Neanderthal dental calculus from multiple sites show clear evidence of starch gelatinization, the molecular signature of cooking with wet heat. One detail from the Shanidar study is particularly haunting. The researchers noted that some of the seed coats from bitter pulses, the parts containing the highest concentration of bitter tannins, appeared to have been intentionally preserved in the final preparation. They had not extracted all the unpalatable compounds. They had left some in, deliberately. As the researchers put it, a Neanderthal flavor of choice. These were people with taste preferences, with culinary aesthetics, with what we would call, without hesitation, if we found the same evidence in modern human contexts, a food culture. Section 9. Earth ovens, boiling, and the Upper Paleolithic kitchen. As the archaeological record moves forward in time, through the Middle Paleolithic into the Upper Paleolithic, roughly from 300,000 years ago through to around 10,000 years ago, the evidence for cooking becomes richer, more varied, and more technically sophisticated. The improvised fire beside which food was placed gives way to deliberate culinary engineering. Around 300,000 years ago, hearths begin to appear across Europe and the Middle East, with enough frequency and regularity that they form a clear pattern in the archaeological record. These are organized structures, roughly circular concentrations of burned material, sometimes surrounded by stones, sometimes set in deliberate shallow pits that helped contain and concentrate the heat. At sites like Khizm Cave in Israel, dating from around 420,000 to 200,000 years ago, evidence of repeated use of a central hearth over an extended period has been documented. The hearth was not rebuilt fresh each day. It was maintained as a permanent installation at the center of the living space, a fixed anchor around which daily life was organized. The archaeology of the site shows large game animals, horses, deer, aurochs, processed and cooked there on a regular basis. Asia by the Upper Paleolithic, roughly 50,000 to 10,000 years ago, the sophistication of food preparation technology increases dramatically. One development stands out as particularly significant: the earth oven. The earth oven represents a genuine technological leap. The basic principle is straightforward, but the results are transformative. You dig a pit in the ground. You gather large stones, ideally dense, heat-retaining rocks, and heat them in a fire until they glow with stored heat. You transfer the hot stones to the pit, place your food on top, cover everything with earth or wet vegetation to trap the heat, and wait. For hours, perhaps all night. The result of this slow, moist, enclosed cooking is radically different from anything achievable over an open flame. The trapped steam keeps food moist throughout. The sustained, but moderate temperature allows tough collagen and connective tissue to break down gradually into gelatin, producing extraordinary tenderness. The gentle, even heat penetrates deeply into large pieces of food without burning the exterior before the interior is cooked. A large joint of meat that would be charred outside and raw inside if cooked rapidly over an open fire emerges from an earth oven perfectly cooked throughout, tender, juicy, and deeply flavorful. The oldest currently confirmed earth ovens have been found at the Pavlov site in what is now the Czech Republic, dating to approximately 29,000 years ago. The Pavlov site is associated with the Gravettian culture, the same people who made ivory figurines, complex bone tools, and musical instruments, who left behind evidence of a rich symbolic and artistic life. At Pavlov 6, an archaeologist found a large stone-lined pit surrounded by the bones of animals, including woolly mammoth, that had been prepared and consumed there. Alongside this cooking pit, the site contained what appear to be separate stone-lined basins used for boiling, adding another technique to what was becoming a genuinely varied culinary repertoire. 29,000 years ago, someone dug a pit, lined it with carefully selected stones, heated those stones, lowered large joints of mammoth wrapped in leaves or hides into the pit, covered everything with earth, and waited while the food slow-cooked through the night. Then they ate. This is not desperate survival. This is craft. This is, in all essential respects, what pit-cooked barbecue still is today. Thus, the question of when boiling first began is complicated by the fact that the obvious early containers, animal hide bags, bark vessels, sealed baskets, leave little or no archaeological trace. Any of these materials can hold water and be used for stone boiling, placing fire-heated rocks directly into a liquid-filled container to bring it to a boil. This technique works even with technically flammable containers because the water continuously absorbs the heat and prevents the container walls from reaching combustion temperature. Ethnographic records from traditional cultures worldwide document stone boiling in skin bags and bark containers as one of the most fundamental cooking methods in the hunter-gatherer toolkit. And it is entirely possible that wet cooking in perishable containers predates any direct archaeological evidence by tens of thousands of years. The first direct archaeological evidence for pottery used in cooking is older than most people expect. Analysis of the oldest known ceramic vessels, found at sites in Japan from the incipient Jomon period, dates to between approximately 15,000 and 16,000 years ago. Molecular analysis of charred residue inside these vessels identified fatty acids from aquatic animals, suggesting these pottery vessels were being used to boil fish and shellfish. These were not agricultural peoples. If they were mobile hunter-gatherers who independently developed ceramic technology because it was useful for processing the rich, aquatic foods available in their environment, thousands of years before the Neolithic Revolution that is usually associated with pottery's invention. This discovery reveals something important about the history of cooking. The development of cooking technology was never a single linear progression from simple to complex, driven by one culture in one place. Different groups in different environments developed different techniques in response to the specific foods available to them. Earth ovens for large game, stone, boiling for soups and broths, pottery for fish and shellfish, roasting on hot coals for roots and tubers. These different techniques were developed in parallel, in different places, so by people solving the same fundamental problem through whatever means their environment and materials provided. Section 10. The First Bakers, Bread Before Farming. One of the most persistent stories in the history of food is a simple sequence. First came farming, then came bread. Agriculture produced surplus grain, and surplus grain made bread making possible. Baking, in this telling, was a product of the Neolithic Revolution, of the settled agricultural societies that emerged in the Fertile Crescent around 10,000 years ago. This story is, in at least one crucial particular, demonstrably wrong. In 2018, a team of researchers published findings that upended this timeline entirely. They had been excavating a site called Shubaika 1 in northeastern Jordan. It's in a region now called the Black Desert, a landscape of volcanic basalt that is stark today, but that 14,000 years ago was considerably more hospitable, scattered with wild cereals, rivers, and game. Shubaika 1 was used by the Natufian people, a culture of sophisticated hunter-gatherers who occupied the Levant during the final millennia before farming began. The Natufians were not farmers. They were mobile foragers, following seasonal resources across the landscape, hunting gazelle, hare, and waterfowl, exploiting wild cereals and other plant foods. They made elaborate groundstone tools, mortars, pestles, and grinding slabs that suggest considerable investment in plant food processing. They buried their dead with personal ornaments. They built semi-permanent structures. They were, by the standards of their time, a culturally sophisticated people. And at Shubaika 1, gathered around a pair of stone fireplaces, the researchers found charred crumbs, tiny blackened fragments of processed plant matter lodged in the swept-out debris of the hearths. When archaeobotanist Amaya Aranz Otaigui examined them under a microscope, she had a moment of genuine confusion. "They looked like what we find in our toasters," she later said, except they were 14,000 years old. Further analysis revealed the ingredients. Wild einkorn wheat, the wild ancestor of domesticated wheat, had been gathered and ground into coarse flour. Clubrush tubers, starchy root plants from wet environments, had been peeled, processed, and incorporated. These ingredients were combined with water into a dough and baked in the hot ashes of the fireplace, or pressed against its hot stone walls. Yet the Natufians of Shubaika 1 were baking flatbread, more than 4,000 years before the first confirmed evidence of domesticated wheat, more than 4,000 years before the agricultural revolution usually credited with making bread possible. Bread making is not simple. Wild wheat must be harvested at exactly the right moment, before the seed heads shatter and release the grain. The harvested grain must be separated from straw and chaff. The grain must then be ground, repeatedly, laboriously, using heavy stone implements. The resulting flour must be mixed with water and shaped, and then it must be baked with careful attention to heat and timing. This is an enormous investment of time and effort for people who were otherwise highly mobile and living without the benefits of settled agricultural abundance. Yet the researchers offered a striking explanation for why the Natufians were making this investment. Perhaps the desire to have bread, a food that requires cultivation to produce reliably, was one of the motivating forces behind the later domestication of wheat and barley. Perhaps the sequence ran not from farming to bread, but from bread to farming. As Gonzalez Carretero, one of the study's co-authors, put it, instead of domesticating cereals first, the bread-making culture could have been something that actually fueled the domestication of cereal. So maybe it was the other way around. This is a remarkable inversion of the conventional story. It places cooking, specifically the cultural preference for certain prepared foods, at the very origin of civilization, not as a consequence of settled agricultural life, but as one of its causes. And there is one more detail from Shubaika worth noting. Alongside the breadcrumbs, researchers found substantial quantities of wild mustard seeds in the cooking area. Wild mustard has a sharp, pungent, unmistakable flavor. These seeds were almost certainly not accidental inclusions. The Natufians were seasoning their bread with mustard. 14,000 years ago, people in what is now Jordan were making flatbread and seasoning it. They were not just surviving, they were cooking. Section 11. The Neolithic Revolution and the Fully Formed Kitchen. The transition from the mobile, foraging world of the Upper Paleolithic to the settled farming world of the Neolithic is one of the most consequential shifts in the entire history of the human species. It unfolded gradually over thousands of years in multiple regions of the world. But when it was complete, the world looked fundamentally different, and nowhere was that difference more visible than in the kitchen. The earliest clear evidence of plant domestication appears in the Near East around 10,000 to 9,500 years ago. Seeds larger and more uniform than their wild counterparts. Sickle blades for harvesting in quantity. Grinding stones for processing grain as a daily routine. Storage facilities implying a predictable annual harvest. The transition was gradual, but its cumulative effect was revolutionary. With settled life came a transformation of cooking technology. The most significant new development was pottery used systematically. Clay pots could boil liquids reliably, store food and protect it from pests, and be placed directly over a fire. Yes, the arrival of pottery meant that the full range of wet cooking techniques became readily accessible to everyday cooks. Soups and stews, long-simmered combinations of meat, vegetables, legumes, and flavoring plants became practical daily possibilities. Grain porridges, probably among the most frequently cooked foods of the early Neolithic, required nothing more than grain, water, and a pot over a fire. The new agricultural diet required new approaches to cooking. Wild cereals could now be stored and processed throughout the year. Domesticated animals provided not just meat, but milk, and milk became a new culinary raw material. The ability to heat milk, to curdle it deliberately, to age fermented dairy products, this opened an entire new dimension of food preparation. Yet the grinding stones found at Neolithic sites tell a particularly important story about the labor involved in this new food culture. Producing flour is genuinely hard physical work. It requires grinding grain between two stones repeatedly and for extended periods. Skeletal analysis of people from early Neolithic populations shows distinctive bone changes consistent with the habitual performance of this grinding motion. Their spines, arm bones, and knee joints show specific stress patterns. They were spending significant time on their knees, pushing and pulling upper grinding stones across lower saddle querns. For these people, flour production was physical labor that left permanent marks on their skeletons. And yet they did it. They invested this substantial effort in turning grain into flour, flour into bread, and bread into the staff of life. Bread became, in agricultural societies, the foundational food, the thing other foods were measured against, the thing that, in many cultures, took on spiritual and symbolic significance. The word companion derives from the Latin cum panis, those who share bread together. The sharing of bread became the paradigmatic act of generosity and fellowship across cultures that had never been in contact with one another. Across different parts of the world, other agricultural revolutions were developing their own culinary traditions. In China, rice cultivation was emerging, and with it the steaming techniques and ceramic cookware that would eventually contribute to one of the world's great culinary cultures. In Mesoamerica, the domestication of maize was creating the conditions for nixtamalization, the alkaline processing of corn with lime that dramatically increases its nutritional value, a process whose sophisticated benefit was understood and practiced by indigenous peoples thousands of years before modern chemistry explained the mechanism. In the Andes, potato cultivation was underway, along with freeze-drying techniques that allowed potatoes to be preserved across seasons in the high-altitude cold. Human cooking had gone global. It had adapted to every environment, every available ingredient, every cultural preference. And all of it, every cuisine, every technique, every recipe, every kitchen tradition in the world today, traces its roots back to those first deliberate and careful applications of heat to food by beings who were not quite us, but were becoming us. Section 12. What the fire gave us. Let us come back to the present for a moment, to that kitchen, that flame, that utterly ordinary daily gesture of applying heat to food. Because seen in the context of everything this story has covered, it looks different now. It carries weight. The act of cooking is, in a very real sense, what made the modern human brain possible. It is what freed the energy that our ancestors needed to develop language, abstract thought, art, and culture. It is what allowed communities to form around the shared hearth. and in those communities to develop the complex social relationships and accumulated knowledge that distinguish human civilization from anything else that has ever existed on this planet. Was to change the way we experience time. Before cooking, the hours of the day were almost entirely allocated between finding food and eating it. Cooking compressed and transformed this. When food is prepared in advance and eaten in a social context, time opens up for conversation, for planning, for teaching, for the slow accumulation of cultural knowledge across generations. It made stories possible in a concrete and physical sense. The campfire created the social space in which stories were told. The transition from the topic-driven, practical conversations of daylight to the narrative, relational, community-building conversations of the fire-lit evening represents something fundamental about how human social life operates. And the campfire was the first shared space, the first place where people who were not directly related could gather in safety and darkness and do something together that was not hunting or gathering, but was simply being human together. It first demonstrated, to our ancestors, that transforming the natural world through knowledge and technique could produce something better than what nature provided alone. A raw tuber is edible but unremarkable. A roasted tuber is sweet, tender, and satisfying in a way that rewards the effort. This is not a trivial observation for a species whose entire evolutionary trajectory would eventually be defined by the application of knowledge to transform the natural world, by technology, by agriculture, by industry, by science. The act of waiting for food to cook is itself significant. It requires patience. It requires the ability to defer immediate satisfaction in the expectation of a better future outcome. These are cognitive capacities, impulse control, future orientation, planning, that are more developed in humans than in any other animal. The willingness to wait at the fire for food to be ready is, in miniature, the same cognitive architecture that allows the building of cathedrals, the development of scientific inquiry, and the writing of histories. The long arc of cooking, from the first accidental encounter with food charred by a natural wildfire to the deliberate, knowledge-intensive food cultures of Neolithic agricultural societies, is also the long arc of the development of human intelligence, social complexity, and cultural depth. These things did not happen separately. They happened together, mutually reinforcing, and each making the others more possible. Cooking made bigger brains possible. Bigger brains made more complex cooking possible. More complex cooking freed more time for social interaction. More social interaction drove the development of language. Language made the transmission of cooking knowledge more efficient. More efficient knowledge transmission made cooking practices more sophisticated, and so on, upward through the spiral of human development, from the first warm ember on the African savanna to the global civilization that now covers the planet. And underneath all of it, under every kitchen, every restaurant, every agricultural field, every ceramic pot and wooden spoon and stone grinding quern, burns the same fire that Homo erectus first carried into Wonderwork Cave 1 million years ago. Not metaphorically. Actually, in terms of the continuous chain of knowledge and practice and cultural transmission that connects every human cook who has ever lived, the fire has never gone out. Section 13, the deepest question. Step all the way back now, past the Neolithic villages, past the Natufian bakers, past the Neanderthal cooks at Shanidar Cave, past the Upper Paleolithic earth ovens and their woolly mammoth feasts, past the Middle Paleolithic hearths, past the systematic fish cooking at Gesher Benot Yaakov, past the million-year-old fire evidence at Wonderwork Cave. Consider the full arc of this story. It begins, in the strictest archaeological sense, at least 780,000 years ago, and quite possibly more than 1 million years ago, with creatures who were not modern humans, who had smaller brains and differently proportioned bodies, and whose daily lives were nothing like ours. And it runs forward through a continuous chain of practice and transmission and refinement to the moment you last turned on your stove. Across that entire span, through ice ages and warm periods, through the emergence and extinction of multiple hominin species, through the development and global spread of Homo sapiens, cooking has never stopped, not once. Every human generation that has ever lived, back further than writing or language or any technology we can identify, has included people who cook their food. The chain of fire has never broken. There is something both humbling and magnificent in that. We are not separate from those ancient people at their lakeside fire. We are the continuation of them. Yet the knowledge they developed, the knowledge of which plants needed soaking, which meats benefited from long, slow cooking, how to manage a fire for controlled heat, how to recognize when food was done, that knowledge did not disappear when they died. It was passed on, modified, expanded, adapted to new environments and new ingredients, but never lost. Every technique in a modern kitchen has ancestors stretching back to the first time someone figured out that heat could make food better. And we carry in our bodies the evolutionary signatures of hundreds of thousands of years of cooking. Our teeth are shaped by it. Our guts are sized by it. Our brains, the extraordinary, expensive, language-using, storytelling, civilization-building brains that make us what we are, may owe their very existence to it. There is a scientific hypothesis, yet growing in credibility and evidence with each passing year, that the most profound transformation in the history of life on this planet was not the evolution of photosynthesis, or the colonization of land, or the development of multicellular life. It was the moment that a living creature, somewhere on the African continent, held a piece of food over a flame and ate it, and thought, that was better. It would be dishonest to close without acknowledging how much remains uncertain. We do not know with certainty when cooking began. We have compelling direct evidence for fish cooking at 780,000 years ago. We have evidence for controlled fire at 1 million years ago. We have the biological argument for cooking beginning as early as 1.8 million years ago. But the archaeological record does not yet directly confirm that earliest date. And it may never fully do so, given how poorly organic fire evidence preserves over such vast timescales. What we do know is this: every time you cook a meal, whether it is something elaborate and carefully prepared or something simple and quick, you are participating in the most ancient and most distinctively human practice that our species has ever developed. You are doing what Homo erectus did on the shores of ancient lakes, what Neanderthals did in the mountains of Iraq 70,000 years ago, what the Natufians did in the Jordanian desert 14,000 years ago, what every human culture, in every place, in every time period, has always done. You are making fire do something useful. You are taking the raw material of the natural world and, through knowledge and patience and the controlled application of heat, you are transforming it into something better. You are, in the most literal and profound sense, being human. And that is where this story finds its resting place. Not with a definitive answer, because the full answer is still being assembled, piece by piece, from the ash-stained sediments of ancient sites and the molecular signatures preserved in fossilized teeth. But with a recognition. The question we started with, how did humans start cooking their food, turns out to reach back further and open into stranger territory than most people imagine. And what the science is finding, with increasing confidence and growing wonder, is that cooking is not something humans do. Cooking is something that made humans. The flame did not just heat the food, the flame made us. If this kind of deep dive into the furthest reaches of human history is what you come here for, then you are exactly where you should be. If you have not already subscribed to History for Sleep, do it now. There are many more stories in the dark, and we will see you for the next one. Leave a like if this kept you awake when you wanted to stay awake, or helped you drift off when you needed to. Take care of yourselves. Sleep well.